Our next speaker is the author of Missing Times, the news media complicity in the UFO cover-up. I think it's one of the most important books on this subject ever. Why? I mean, it's just about the media. Look, the relationship to the media in this issue from the beginning is totally determined, not totally, but a significant determination of how it's all played out. The media could have ended this issue anytime they wanted to, but they did not. And there are reasons for that, and those reasons need to be studied extremely carefully. Anyway, the impact of this book on the disclosure process cannot be overstated. It was the first book devoted exclusively to a key component of the truth embargo, past media compliance, deliberate or otherwise, with the government policy of denial, actually non-denial denial. Funding permitting, PRG still hopes to send a copy of this book to the publishers of every major newspaper and every television network owner with the simple message, read this and wake up. And the only reason it hasn't been done is that, that's a lot of books, probably 400 or 500. It's a lot of money. Don't have the money to do it. If I have the money, we'll buy the books, and we will actually send them out.
Our speaker is an independent journalist and magazine publisher with an interest in scientific controversies and the politics of mass media. He's followed the UFO controversy for decades and has written about it for various media. In addition, he's organized and moderated 2 symposiums about the science and politics of the UFO research for the Science Museum in Minnesota. He's spoken about the news media's role in the UFO controversy on various national radio and television shows, including Dreamland and the History Channel. He holds a bachelor's degree in biology and a master's in science journalism, both from the University of Minnesota. He retired from the magazine publishing industry and now lives in the Canadian Gulf Islands with his wife, Jess.
Missing Times is an investigation into whether some of America's most influential news organizations, many of which have maintained close ties to the U.S. intelligence community, have willingly suppressed full and accurate news coverage of the UFO phenomena for a variety of national security reasons. A full investigation and review by Congress and the American people of this issue, the issues raised in this book, is absolutely essential, not for the purposes of blame and retribution, but to reform and restructure the social contract to preserve and protect the core values and strengths of the Republic.
Please welcome Terry Hansen to X Conference 2008.
When I was putting this presentation together, I was kind of surfing the web and I came across this old cartoon of what seems to be a U.S. congressman hustling up the ladder to throw a bucket of water on the light of liberty. And this is sort of a perennial response of the U.S. government to anything threatening, real or imagined. And it seemed appropriate for this presentation and also appropriate for the times we're living in, and certainly appropriate for the UFO topic. I have not been to Washington, D.C. for many, many years, and many years ago when I was, before I got involved in the media business, I worked for a company called Honeywell, and they sent me out to Washington, D.C. to familiarize me with the real world, quote unquote. I was writing training courses at that time, and they wanted to give me a sense of who my ultimate readers were. When I was here, a couple of the salesmen took me out on a sales call to what they described as a large government customer. And we got in the car and drove a long time and reached a sign on the highway that said Commerce Department. We turned off, and it wasn't the Commerce Department, it was the headquarters of the Central Intelligence Agency. So we parked the car and went, strode into the lobby across this big seal of the CIA on the floor, and sat. They put us in a little, they signed us in and put us in a waiting room and ultimately escorted us through the CIA building to the building engineer's office. And the building engineer explained to us that he was having a lot of trouble with controlling temperatures in the CIA building. They were fluctuating, and he couldn't figure out what was going on. So he wanted to know if Honeywell could provide some kind of system that would allow him to monitor what was going on in the CIA building temperature-wise. Well, I didn't think too much about this incident. After that, we left the CIA and went on with my life. But several years later, I was reading a book about the history of the CIA, and the author related a story that sort of lit up a light bulb in my head about why I was there. Evidently, the CIA, when it was established, was so paranoid about even basic information about what they were doing that they would not disclose the number of people working in the CIA building. And this created a number of problems, particularly for the people who designed the heating, ventilating, and air conditioning system, because you have to know what the heat load in the building is in order to keep it comfortable. So they had to just guess at how many people were working there, and as luck would have it, they guessed wrong. So this created a long chain of problems for the building engineers for many years thereafter. CIA employees were constantly tinkering with thermostat, trying to get it warmer or colder, and the building was swinging wildly up and down in temperature. And they finally tried to solve it by putting little locks on all the thermostats. But since the CIA employees were trained in lockpicking, they simply jimmied the locks and they kept playing around with it. So when I read this, like I say, it was like an enlightenment. I just realized what my connection was and what that trip actually was all about. I was involved in this little drama over kind of blowback from the CIA's obsessive secrecy. So it seemed to me that there was, aside from being a sort of amusing story, there was a bit of a moral there about the hidden cost of secrecy on a small scale, but when you scale it up to an entire nation, it becomes debilitating, if not completely destabilizing. And I think that we're in a situation like that now where there's so much secrecy and so much obsessive and unnecessary secrecy that it is actually threatening our government and way of life. This, of course, is largely what brought down the Soviet Union, or at least one of the things that brought down the Soviet Union. I thought I'd throw up this little somewhat ironic set of pictures here and ask rhetorically which event never happened, the moon landing or the Roswell crash. And the answer kind of depends on where you were living and what your background is. I had a friend in Seattle who left the Soviet Union after the collapse of the government there, the old regime. And one day he was over at my house, and we got on the subject of the space program. I pulled out some video discs of the Apollo astronauts walking on the moon and so on, and he watched this with great fascination. And then at one point, he got a very strange expression on his face, and he said, "Those bastards, they never showed us any of this stuff." So I thought that was amazing. And I just wonder if sometime down the road in our own future development that we will be saying the same thing about our government. There's a myth that we have in the United States, and of course it's propagated largely by the media itself, that we have a free press and that any event of any significance is immediately picked up on and broadcast worldwide by a very aggressive media establishment. You watch CNN, as you can see in the slide here, they've got all these video cameras and computer systems and all that, and you get the impression that everything is instantly propagated. But the reality, unfortunately, is much different than that. This is a little poster created by an organization called Indie Media, and it says, "You write what you're told, thanks corporate news. We couldn't control the people without you." That may be a little cynical, but there is quite a good basis for this, as I'll explain in my presentation. The main things I want to cover today are why news organizations cooperate with the federal government. Now, as I say, the media tries to convince us that they're independent, but the reality is that they work rather closely with the government on many things, especially national security issues, quote unquote. I want to talk a little bit about how news censorship is achieved based on what we know of the history of the relationship between the media and government, how propaganda works to hide important events and limit public curiosity. I'll talk a little bit about the ways we might circumvent these deceptions in regard to UFOs, and I'd like to leave you with a few thoughts about national security and then end with prospects for achieving a more open, accountable federal government. So why do organizations cooperate with the federal government? Now, when you talk to somebody in the media and suggest that they're colluding with the government, they would, of course, reject that, and if not, even laugh at you for suggesting it. But there's a long history behind this, and I think it's worth going over that. Before World War I think there was fairly good separation between the big media, the national media companies, and the federal government. But what happened was that Britain was locked in a stalemate with Germany, and they needed to bring the United States into the war on their side in order to break the stalemate. Now, Britain had a very sophisticated propaganda machine. Americans were not in favor of getting involved in World War I initially. There was a lot of opposition. We weren't a naturally belligerent country or imperialistic country, and so the public really didn't want to get involved in World War I. But the British sort of focused their propaganda apparatus away from Europe and turned it on the United States, and they enlisted the help of President Wilson in this. And Wilson, in turn, appointed a journalist by the name of George Creel, who was a progressive journalist. Now, the progressive journalists were kind of muckrakers. They were trying to expose corruption and misdeeds in government and business and so on. And so by bringing Creel into the U.S. government to manage the propaganda and censorship machine, it was sort of a political stroke of genius because it gave it instant credibility. And this big institution that Creel created was called the Committee on Public Information. It sounds kind of innocuous, but it was really a propaganda operation. Now, the CPI, as it was called, went on to enlist other news organizations and journalists of the day to promote World War I. And so the public opinion through this massive effort was shifted away from being anti-war to pro-war. This really was the first instance in which the media companies and the U.S. government began working together on a large scale, organized, systematic propaganda operation. Now, in World War II, this really began to ramp up. Again, as in World War I, the American people were not anxious to get into the war. There was a very active anti-war movement led by Charles Lindbergh, and it was successful in keeping us out of the war for a while. But Pearl Harbor changed all that, as we all know. And this became a total war in the sense that our media really got on board with the Pentagon, almost became absorbed by the Pentagon. There was no independent news organizations that were not under control of the federal government in some way. Our intelligence apparatus at that time was relatively unsophisticated about the use of the news media in warfare. And Britain, which had been running a great global empire for quite a long time, knew all the tricks about this, and so they tutored U.S. intelligence in the uses of deception. At this time, the propaganda and censorship had become much more sophisticated, and so they were actually separated from one large organization into two. One was the Office of Censorship, which administered control of the news, and the Office of War Information, which administered war propaganda. And these organizations were staffed by leading media executives and journalists and so on. Everybody sort of got on board with the war effort. They were into it. And it not only consolidated the relationship between the U.S. military intelligence establishment and the news organizations, but it sort of almost completely dissolved any impartial or objective reporting, certainly about the war and many other things. Now, after the Cold War, there was a brief interval. There was something called the War Powers Act that provided the legal basis for censorship and propaganda during World War II, and that expired, of course, with the end of the war. So there was an interval from about 1946 or 1945 up to, say, 1953, when there wasn't really a large institution responsible for propaganda. And the CIA was given that task. I personally feel that this is one of the reasons why we know so much about what the UFO phenomenon was doing in the late 40s, early 50s, because the censorship apparatus sort of relaxed for a while after the war and then ramped back up again with the creation of the CIA. Now, one important thing to remember is that although the World War II was over, the top media executives that had participated in censoring the news retained their ties to the national security state throughout the Cold War. And in fact, it's been said that the news media embraced the assumption that the U.S. faced a permanent hostile threat. That just became sort of an underlying assumption about the world. And this was reflected in the way the newspapers covered things. Actually, there was kind of a revolving door between the elite media. By the elite media, I mean all the big national news organizations, Time, New York Times, Washington Post, etc., and the intelligence agencies. People working for the intelligence community would go to work covertly inside the media. Media people would go to work for the intelligence community. They were constantly going back and forth. The CIA under a gentleman named Frank, I've heard it pronounced Wiesner. I've always pronounced it Weisner. I don't know exactly which is correct. But under Frank Wiesner, the CIA built a global propaganda machine that had hundreds and hundreds of different assets, as they called it. And those ranged from stringers to top news reporters to media executives to entire publishing companies. They spent lavishly on this type of activity. Someone I know who's an expert on this thinks that the CIA spends approximately a third of its budget on propaganda. And if this is true, then today the CIA is probably spending in the neighborhood of $10 billion a year on propaganda, which even these days is not small change. Now, why was the CIA created? We think we know the answer, or at least there's an official answer to that, and that is that the intelligence community screwed up prior to Pearl Harbor, and that allowed the Japanese to slip through and carry out their sneak attack. That's been the official story in history for quite some time. But this has been questioned by a gentleman named Robert Stinnett, who wrote a book called Day of Deceit. And he, Stinnett argues that, in fact, FDR maneuvered the Japanese into attacking. He sort of backed them into a corner through a number of policy initiatives, and that naval intelligence, our naval intelligence, was monitoring the Japanese communications, and they knew they were breaking their codes, and they knew pretty much what the Japanese were doing as they approached, and we just let them attack because we wanted a rationale. We wanted something that would, or FDR wanted something to get the people really fired up and overcome this anti-war opposition that Lindbergh had been leading. This seems very plausible to me. A lot of people might question that and find that it's not true, but it's an interesting book and it's worth considering. So the question this raises, let's assume that it is true, what was the real reason the CIA was created? If the intelligence community knew that Pearl Harbor was not actually a sneak or a surprise, then there may have been another reason for creation of the CIA. I'm just speculating here, but I think it's sort of enlightened speculation. One of the reasons I say this was that when the CIA was created through the National Security Act of 1947, one of the real driving forces behind this very controversial legislation was James Forrestal. Well, Forrestal, as you may know, was once Secretary of the Navy and then became, I guess, Secretary of Defense or War. I'm not sure exactly what his title was. You probably know that Forrestal is thought by many people in the UFO community to have been part of this MJ-12 group. So he was kind of an insider, and he had an interest in the UFO issue and probably may have had an interest in giving the CIA powers that were necessary for keeping the CIA, or keeping the news media and information about UFOs under wraps. Well, we know what happened during the Iraq invasion. It's a pretty depressing record from the point of view of journalists. News organizations pretty much unquestioningly embraced the official rationale for attacking Iraq, and reporters joined the U.S. military forces. They pretty much gave up any possibility of impartial or objective reporting. And, well, you know, by 2004, half the public believed 9/11 was the cause for attacking Iraq, which in fact the two events were not really related as far as we can tell. And of course, oil was never mentioned during this whole buildup. So this is kind of demonstrating that the media, even today, are still very compliant with government policies. Now, a lot of these covert ties between the media establishment and the CIA were exposed back in the 1970s, late 1970s, and it was publicized by a lot of different sources. This is an article from Rolling Stone. There were articles in Columbia Journalism Review and many other publications, and eventually the New York Times came out and said, yeah, we were doing this kind of stuff. CBS sort of said the same thing. So it became public knowledge, and the implication at the time was, well, you know, this was all justifiable in the times, and we won't do it anymore. But in reality, there were never any laws put in place to prevent this kind of thing from continuing, and I will argue that things have not really changed very much. Now, this is just an article. This is an obituary of Sig Mickelson, who was the first director of CBS TV News, and he's the guy who hired Walter Cronkite, who I'll talk about a little bit. And he's saying, or he's quoted in this obituary as saying, "I didn't raise an eyebrow about cooperating with the CIA back then. It was just a casual relationship that CBS would do things for the CIA when they wanted it." Now, here's another article. This was in the New York Times, March 24th, 2001. This came out after my book was published, unfortunately. Bad timing. But it says that the CIA sought to plant news on Cuba in '61. It's basically saying that the AP and UPI wire services were working with the CIA, and they were making their worldwide news distribution network available so that the CIA could place propaganda stories onto the news wires worldwide. And this is important for understanding the UFO topic, as we'll see in a little while. Now, have things changed? If you go on the website and look at who is in charge of National Public Radio and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, you will see that they have a history of working for U.S. government propaganda operations. This is Robert Coonrad, who I think has actually stepped down from CPB, but he's been replaced by somebody with a similar background. And this, to me, as a journalist, is an obvious and very glaring conflict of interest. I mean, why should you put somebody who's spent his career in propaganda in charge of a news organization if you want some reasonably objective portrayal of world events? And I think the answer is that they don't want such coverage. This is Kevin Close. I think he's still president and CEO of National Public Radio. And again, if you read his resume here, he worked for Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty and Radio Marti and so on, all these government propaganda operations before coming to NPR. So it doesn't give me a lot of confidence, actually, in NPR's objectivity. Now, at the same time this has been going on, the U.S. government, Congress mostly, and some of our presidents have really allowed the news media in the U.S. to become greater or more and more concentrated. And this is just a chart showing how this has progressed over time from 1983 to 2004. And you can see by 2004 that there were only about 5 large corporations controlling most of the U.S. media. Now, if you're running propaganda operations, that's a really great situation because you only have to deal with a very small number of news organizations. Not a good development for democracy, in my opinion. Okay, so I talked about why the government works with the news media. And by the way, these are not representatives of these news organizations. But I want to talk about censorship and really how it works in the practical sense. Again, we think of ourselves as living in a free country with a free press and all that, but there are actually quite a few ways that things can be covered up. Censorship is really only the first part of a two-step process when the government or any government wants to deceive people about world events. First thing they do is close down access to real-world events through censorship, and then they substitute a carefully manufactured reality in place of what's actually happening. And I have a couple of quotes here from people who were influential in developing this theory. One is Walter Lippmann. He said, "Without some form of censorship, propaganda in the strict sense of the word is impossible. In order to conduct a propaganda, there must be some barrier between the public and the event. Access to the real environment must be limited before anyone can create a pseudo-environment that he thinks is wise or desirable." And then propaganda, Edward L. Bernays is a very influential public relations or propaganda expert, and he said propaganda is the executive arm of the invisible government. Okay, so how does propaganda work? Well, if you study the history of propaganda, you can come up with a list of techniques that are used repeatedly, and this is kind of a summary here. One of the most common is just what they call censorship at source or military censorship. A lot of UFO sightings, as you know, take place near military facilities, and it's pretty easy for the military simply to order its personnel not to talk. Another thing they do is they have discrete contacts. They may call up a major newspaper or radio station or a news organization of some type and just ask them not to cover a story because of national security reasons without really justifying it. And that happens quite a lot. Often major journalists are recruited covertly into the intelligence apparatus and go on working as journalists, but they have a double life. They're really working for the intelligence community. They monitor and intercept important news reports, particularly on the wire services. There are a lot of people are asked to sign lifetime secrecy agreements. There's surveillance of organizations and individuals, confiscation or theft of evidence, character assassination, threats, harassment, incarceration, and the more sinister of all, assassination. Okay, I'm going to talk just a little bit about censorship in World War II. Believe me, I'll get to UFOs eventually. In 1935, the Naval Intelligence was given the task of censoring cable, radio, and overseas telephone circuits. And they were assigned, or military intelligence was assigned censorship of overseas mail and telegraph lines. So you can see that the military was gearing up for World War II a long time before before the Pearl Harbor attacks occurred. A year before Pearl Harbor, in December 1940, Navy Secretary Frank Knox asked the U.S. media to withhold all unauthorized Navy news. Again, this is sort of an example of how they ask for and receive cooperation from the big news organizations. December 7th, a lot of the news about Pearl Harbor was thought to be too shocking, and it was actually withheld from the public for some time. December 1941, Byron Price, who was executive editor of the Associated Press, was sworn in as director of censorship. Now again, you see the connection, the importance of the wire services in censorship, because the wire services were the way that newspapers and radio stations across the country find out about world events. So if you control the wire services, you've really got a good handle on the situation. Now, Price went on to hire other leading media executives, especially John Sorrells, who was executive editor of Scripps Howard, and they owned United Press International, another wire service at the time. Okay, now during World War II, as I say, there was really no free press during the war years, except on rather mundane matters. And there was a lot of UFO activity during World War II, but it was covered by the blanket of censorship that existed at the time. This is an article from Newsweek, I guess, December 25th, Newsweek, 1944. And it says in the article here that dispatches, quote, heavily censored by Supreme Headquarters, and we're talking about these spheres that were floating around and so on. So this is sort of a hint that there was something big going on and that it was being censored by the apparatus. There's a good book that I just read called Strange Company. I would recommend it, by Keith Chester. This goes into the UFO or the Foo Fighter phenomenon in much greater detail than I had been familiar with, and it makes it quite clear, first of all, that the UFO activity was much more widespread in World War II than I had realized anyway. And it also makes it clear that a gentleman by the name of Dr. H.P. Robertson was at the core of all the intelligence gathering about this phenomenon. Some of you may know about H.P. Robertson. I'll come back to talk about him later. But this is interesting to me because it shows that Robertson was tracking this subject a long, long time before the Robertson panel met, which I'll talk about. And another interesting thing about this is that, as far as I know, there's no, even though there were a lot of sightings of these things, there's no publicly available gun camera footage from any of the fighters and other aircraft, which seems sort of odd, and it suggests that there's still quite a bit of censorship in effect about this phenomenon from World War II. Well, after World War II, the nature of our government began to change. I was going to say before that if you read the First Amendment, it says Congress shall make no laws restricting freedom of the press. Well, that seems pretty unambiguous to me, but in reality, because of the fear of various things, in the 40s and 50s, the U.S. government began creating a lot of laws that began restricting the flow of information. And these are just some of them. There was the Atomic Energy Act that ushered in what's called an instant classification of any new scientific knowledge that was deemed to be important. There was, as I've mentioned before, the 1947 National Security Act, which created the CIA. There was something called the UK-USA Treaty, which was a treaty between all the English-speaking countries to share certain kinds of intelligence data. And then in 1951, there was something called the Invention Secrecy Act that allowed the U.S. government to seize new inventions on national security grounds. If you invent something and you file for a patent, it has to go through a national security review by the Department of Defense, Department of Energy, and NASA. And if they decide, for whatever reasons they use, that it's a national security threat, they can basically confiscate your idea. And this has been done thousands of times. So this whole new official censorship apparatus began to spread throughout the entire governmental apparatus and into the news media. Now in 1953, the Robertson panel orders the debunking of UFOs, which I'll talk about, and then the classification of all kinds of government information just begins to sort of mushroom out of control, to use a phrase. Now, some people, the CIA has always tried to suggest that, well, we never really carried out this plan to debunk UFOs through the media. It's just something we talked about as a possibility. But if you read a book by Coral Lorenzen, who was an early UFO researcher connected with an organization called the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, or APRO, she mentions in her book a discussion with Lieutenant Robert Olson of the Air Technical Intelligence Command. And Olson told her, we're going to try to keep UFO reports out of the newspapers. So there's an indication that the Robertson panel was really going to have an effect. The word had gone out into the intelligence community that censorship was coming down on the UFO topic. One of the big problems the U.S. government had in the 1950s was that many UFO reports, and some of the most impressive ones, were being reported by airline pilots. Airline pilots were, for good reason, considered credible sources. A lot of them had flown in World War II. They had combat experience. They were trained observers. The lives of their passengers depended on their ability to discern small details. So they were considered quite credible, and their stories were fantastic. And if you read some of these articles, it's amazing stuff. It really is quite astonishing. And it was reported by the military that pilots were reporting about 5 to 10 UFOs per night. Now remember, this was an era when air transportation was much less extensive than it is today. So the fact that they were getting that many reports was really quite astonishing, and it must have been very unsettling to the military intelligence people. At any rate, this was kind of a public relations crisis, because the government, these stories were getting into the newspapers, they were circulating nationally, and they really had to do something about this. So one of the things they did was they made UFOs a national security topic. in a document called JNAP 146. And the effect of this was that pilots were ordered to report their UFO sightings to the military intelligence people. And once they did that, they became sensitive data under the national security laws, and pilots were not allowed to talk to them or talk to the media about them. So this really kind of swept the whole scene clean of these pilot reports. Here's another page of JNAP 146 showing that unidentified flying objects were one of the things that pilots were required to report. Now there was a reaction against this by the pilots on the East Coast. This is an article from the Newark, New Jersey Star-Ledger from December 22nd, 1958. And a group of 50 commercial airline pilots protested this heavy-handed censorship by the Air Force. And later they were joined by about 400 other airline pilots. So 450 pilots essentially were protesting this censorship. But it really didn't have much effect because ultimately it came down to whether they wanted to keep their jobs or not. And so they were happy to trade their civil liberties for their paycheck. And today, of course, airline companies continue to strongly discourage their pilots or other employees from discussing UFO sightings. If you followed the O'Hare Airport sighting of some time back, the airline personnel were very strongly discouraged from talking to the media about this incident. Okay, wire service censorship. I want to talk a little bit about that. I mentioned that as being one of the techniques, common techniques for controlling information. You know from the Roswell incident, regardless of what it was all about, that one of the wire service reporters was told in no uncertain terms not to transmit this information when she began typing a story about it onto the wire. Another indication that this is happening, or that the censorship about UFOs is happening on the wire services, is that when the University of Colorado was holding its investigation into the UFO phenomenon called the Condon Commission, one of the local reporters from from a local paper was asked by the Denver AP Bureau to do a story on the Condon Commission. And he thought, well, this is a great opportunity to sort of smoke out the local CIA spooks if they're out there, and he suspected they were. So he wrote up his story purposely implicating the CIA in the UFO topic, and he filed it with the AP on request of the AP, thinking that if the CIA was monitoring things through the AP, they would kill the story. And he went back to his office and waited for the story to come over the wire, and of course it never did. So this confirmed to him anyway that the Condon Commission was being stage managed by the intelligence community. Now we know of many other examples of vanishing stories, major stories that were locally reported in either the US or other countries where the news just seemed to stop, in the area where it occurred and didn't propagate beyond that. I could go on. There's a long list of examples, but there's a few of them on the screen here. A contrary example of this, I think, is that although the newspapers don't report UFO stuff, we all know that the internet does. So why is it that if the news media are so conscientious about telling us about world events, we can find out so much on the internet that they never talk about? I think this illustrates there's sort of two worldviews being presented to us. There's the worldview of what people experience, and there's the official worldview that comes through in the national news media. Okay, well, I've talked a little bit about censorship, and I give many other examples in my book about how, some people recognize this picture, about how censorship has been applied to the UFO controversy. I can only give a few examples in a short talk like this. But I'll switch to propaganda now. This is a picture from the famous movie, The Wizard of Oz, and as you recall, if you've seen the movie, at one point, Dorothy's little dog, Toto, goes over and pulls the curtain back and reveals this guy behind the curtain manipulating these controls and creating the great frightening Wizard of Oz. Well, that's kind of what propaganda people do. They're always tinkering with the social signals that we're getting to influence what we believe in or what we think is happening. There's, again, a long list of methods, specific methods used to do this. We've seen a lot of these in the UFO field: cover stories, spin control, investigations that are really bogus, like the Condon Commission and Project Blue Book. Recruitment of influential people as spokespersons, use of group leaders to influence lower-ranking members of society, front organizations, targeting of selected groups, psychological manipulation, rumors and misleading information or disinformation, use of deep cover agents to spread propaganda, films and TV programs produced under contract, books and articles. These are all very common techniques and frequently employed by the CIA. Okay, well, I'm going to get back to the Robertson panel again. In 1953, the Robertson panel met, and it almost immediately recommended a covert mass media program of training and debunking. And they said that the debunking aim would result in reduction of public interest in flying saucers, which today evokes a strong psychological reaction. This education could be accomplished by mass media such as television, motion pictures, and popular articles. So again, you can see that this is a very typical way the government has responded to a crisis. They're pulling out all their old bags of tricks and implementing them to deal with the UFO problem. And of course, this came shortly after 1952, which was a pivotal year. 1952 there was an explosion of UFO activity across the United States. This happened in the same year that we lit off our first hydrogen bomb, by the way, which may not be a coincidence. Okay, well, who was H.P. Robertson, the guy that the Robertson panel is named after? He was quite an influential guy, as it turns out. Not only was he a leading physicist, an associate of people of the caliber of Einstein and Oppenheimer, but he was also a scientific intelligence officer in World War II, and he was the chief liaison between American and British scientific intelligence. So he was really kind of in the best channel for getting any information about these types of things. And as I said in the book about Foo Fighters, Robertson had been monitoring this weird stuff during World War II. So by the time the Robertson panel met in 1953, he had quite a long history of experience with this subject. It's not like he just sort of was brought in and didn't know anything about it. Another thing about Robertson is that during World War II, he'd become close friends with a gentleman by the name of Dr. Reginald Victor Jones, R.V. Jones. If you know about the history of World War II, R.V. Jones was one of Britain's leading experts on scientific intelligence and deception, and he continued to have an interest in that for many years after World War II. Probably he was a consultant to the U.S. government and various other intelligence agencies. And he evidently played a behind-the-scenes role in both the Robertson panel and the Condon Commission, which I find very interesting. Okay, so has the media actually been playing ball with the Robertson panel? Is there any hard evidence for that? I didn't think I would actually find any when I started working on my book, but as luck would have it, I mentioned what I was working on to Mark Rodiger at the Center for UFO Studies, and he mentioned it to Michael Swords. Michael Swords is a sociologist who's been interested in the UFO topic, and he had been doing a lot of research on the Robertson panel and related things, and he'd come across this interesting letter from the Smithsonian Archives, or it was in the Smithsonian Archives. It's a letter written to Fred Durant from Thornton Page. Thornton Page was a member of the Robertson panel in 1953, and he sort of does something kind of stupid here from the point of view of an intelligence person. He mentions, or he sort of tells Page in writing, he said, I remember Q building and flying saucers well, etc. And then he says, I helped organize the CBS TV show around the Robertson panel's conclusions. So he's basically confirming what we've long suspected, that yes, indeed, the Robertson panel was having a big influence on how the U.S. media was portraying the UFO subject. Now, the program he's referring to here is a program called UFOs, Friend, Foe, or Fantasy, and it was broadcast by CBS News on a documentary series they had called CBS Reports. Some of you who are old enough may remember that. And if you watch the program today, and you can do that, it's remarkable. I mean, if you watch it, it just sort of jumps out at you. Boy, these guys just seem to be following the Robertson panel's recommendations right down the line. Well, we now know that that's not just a coincidence. CIA was working with CBS to get the message out. Okay, I don't have any direct ties between other news organizations and the Robertson panel, but I think the history of the New York Times and its coverage of the UFO topic is very suspicious, and I would argue that there's strong circumstantial evidence that the CIA, or the Robertson panel, and the New York Times were working together in some fashion. And here are my reasons for thinking this. First of all, the CIA wanted to suppress U.S. news, UFO news coverage, so we know this from history. And suppressing coverage would require the cooperation of the major news services, UPI, AP, New York Times, etc. Now, the New York Times publisher, Arthur Sulzberger's policy was to help the CIA whenever possible. He'd said that on some occasions. There was a content analysis, too, done by some academics at Berry College, and they found that the reporting in the New York Times about the UFO subject became increasingly anti-UFO, sort of an overt anti-UFO bias over time that sort of suggests that there was something going on. They were being asked not to report it straight. There's also kind of a chronic institutional amnesia at the New York Times. They don't seem to remember much about American history, especially when it comes to certain areas, which is really odd. Now, both CBS and the New York Times supported Hynek's bogus swamp gas theory. That was kind of a laughingstock at the time. The regional news media were just joking about that explanation, but CBS and the New York Times got behind it, and they backed it, which is sort of suggestive. There's an unwillingness at the New York Times to check UFO-related facts. I could give you lots of examples, but I don't have time, so I'll just go on. There's an unwillingness to correct UFO-related reporting errors when they're brought to their attention. And there's a willingness to report false CIA claims about UFOs without doing any fact-checking. And finally, there's a documented history of cooperation between the New York Times and the CIA for quote-unquote national security reasons. So, it doesn't look very good. This is an article from the New York Times, December 16, 1954. This was, believe it or not, was on the front page of the New York Times, and the headline is "President Discounts Saucers from Space." President Eisenhower said today an Air Force official had assured him that flying saucers were not invading the Earth from outer space. And the article goes on to sort of make fun of the whole topic of UFOs. So you can see what they're doing here. They're taking the government side. There are lots of other examples of disinformation in the media. This was, well, you know all about the various stories that they've come out with about Roswell, so I won't talk about that too much. In many cases where there's been a reported crash of a UFO, you find a lot of disinformation creeping into the media. This was brought to my attention by the Woods, and it's an example where some names were changed in a newspaper article about an alleged UFO crash, and suggestive that somebody is sort of playing with the news content a little bit. Well, okay, this brings me to a very interesting example of what I think is propaganda, and that is that, as you probably know, one of the very few publications during the 60s and 70s to cover the UFO subject regularly was the National Enquirer. So it kind of got a reputation for that. And when there were some very serious overflights by UFOs at nuclear missile sites throughout Montana, a subject that was widely reported in Montana but not elsewhere in the country, the story first broke on the national level of all places, the National Enquirer, and it took about a year to do that, I think. But I'm sorry, it took 2 years for the story to break in the National Enquirer. even though it had been widely reported in the state of Montana, was known about by many thousands of people. Again, you see this phenomenon that the story seems to be bottled up and then maybe started leaking out through word of mouth or by whatever means. And so who covers it first? The National Enquirer. Well, what effect does that have? When you think about it, the National Enquirer has a reputation for sort of questionable reporting. So if you go going through the checkout stand and you see this headline, UFOs spotted at nuclear bases and missile sites, National Enquirer. Well, immediately, you're going to reject it, right? I mean, that's the psychological impact. Well, there's some interesting things about the National Enquirer that not a lot of people know. I'll give you a chronology of the newspaper. It's very illuminating. In World War II, there was a newspaper at that time called Il Progresso on the East Coast. And Il Progresso was an Italian language paper, and it had been supporting Mussolini. And this came to the attention of the U.S. intelligence community. They wanted to know why the publisher was backing a fascist, basically. And so they infiltrated the newspaper, and the Office of Strategic Services infiltrated its staff into Il Progresso to sort of figure out what was going on. And they actually found out that the publisher, Gene Pope Sr., was not really a fascist. He just wanted better relations between Italy and the U.S. But at any rate, 1946, Gene Pope Sr.'s son, Gene Pope Jr., graduates from MIT at age 19 in engineering. Now, MIT is a pretty tough school, and to graduate at age 19 in engineering suggests that he was a very sharp cookie. 1950, his father dies, Gene Pope Sr. dies, and there's sort of an internal family struggle over control of Il Progresso. And for some reason, Gene Pope Jr. lost out and didn't get control of the paper. So he had to find another job, and he went to work for the CIA's psychological warfare unit, according to him. That's what he said. Now, in 1952, after working for the CIA for a while, he leaves. He's now 25 years old, and he purchases the New York Enquirer from the Hearst chain and renames it the National Enquirer. And this cost about $75,000 using what Pope described as an interest-free loan. And he put $20,000 down. Now, that doesn't sound like a lot of money these days, but you have to go back to 1952 when the American dollar was a lot stronger than it is now. The source of this money that he used to buy what became the Enquirer has always been a mystery, and many people have thought that it came from the mafia because certainly the Pope family had ties to certain mafia members, particularly Frank Costello. But Costello was also tied in with the OSS, by the way, sort of another intelligence community connection there. But Pope vigorously denied that the money came from the mob, so it raises the question, where did it come from? The amount of money that he spent getting the National Enquirer off the ground in 2003 dollars is about $1.6 million. So here you have a 25-year-old kid. He leaves the CIA, buys a newspaper, and has tremendous assets at his disposal. Where does it come from? Follow the money, but you can't follow the money because there's no way to do that. I think it's very likely it came from the CIA because the CIA was spending quite a bit of money on things like this at the time. One of the Enquirer's first employers is Bill Bates, who was a former OSS officer, another tie with the intelligence community. And as I said, in the 50s, the CIA was spending a lot of money on just this kind of thing. 1953, the Robertson panel calls for a mass media program of training and debunking, as I mentioned. And in the 60s and 70s, the Enquirer establishes a reputation for sensational UFO reporting, often combining sleazy articles about celebrities and so on with UFOs, and sort of makes the whole subject a laughing stock. Although, oddly enough, surprisingly enough for some people, a lot of the Enquirer's coverage was quite factual. It was quite accurate, although by mixing it in with this other type of coverage, most people didn't think so. In the 1970s, Pope was having trouble getting his newspaper into the Winn-Dixie grocery store chain. And he got help from, of all people, Melvin Laird, who was Nixon's Secretary of Defense. And what happened was that Melvin Laird arranged for a tour of the White House for Winn-Dixie grocery store executives. And they were so impressed with Pope's high-level connections in the government that they agreed to let his paper into their store. And a Forbes magazine reporter writing about this said, he asked Pope, how is it you have these kind of connections with the White House? I mean, you're just a tabloid publisher. And Pope just responded kind of mysteriously. He said, well, it's politics. One hand washes the other. Well, that suggests to me that Pope was doing something for the government, and the government was doing something for him. Was that UFO related? We don't know for sure, but it looks pretty suspicious. Now, when Pope died in 1988, by the way, he was one of America's wealthiest men at the time. He was worth, I think, around $400 million. Who gave the eulogy at his funeral but the former Defense Secretary, Melvin Laird. So you can kind of make of that what you want, but my interpretation of it is that the National Enquirer was some sort of intelligence operation, and it may, at least part of its function may have been to debunk UFOs, which is what the CIA wanted to do. Now, somebody said, well, that's really awfully complicated and seems unlikely that the CIA would go to all this trouble just to accomplish an objective like that. But according to writer Gore Vidal, when John Kenneth Galbraith was in India as ambassador under John Kennedy, he came across a newspaper very much like the National Enquirer, and he started making some inquiries as to who was running it. It was a really funny-looking paper, I guess, and he found out that it was a CIA operation. So again, this is an example of how the CIA has used this sort of technique in other circumstances to debunk certain ideas. Maybe it was political ideas that they were trying to debunk there. I don't know what their objective was. So there you have it. Now, let's kind of put all this together a little bit. If you're trying to conduct a propaganda campaign, you can't do it by just using one or two newspapers. You've got to have everybody on board. Otherwise, there will be a mismatch between what some people are reporting and what other people are reporting. The best scenario you can have is that all the media are singing the same tune. And of course, Frank Wiesner of the CIA used to brag that he could make the news media play any song he wanted them to play. He referred to his magical Wurlitzer of media assets that he could summon, rather like the guy in The Wizard of Oz, to create a picture of reality that the CIA wanted. So here's kind of how it works. You've got the Robertson panel recommending a program of debunking. They call upon the CIA's media assets, which number, as I say, hundreds of organizations, but certainly include all the news organizations here. And the ones that have clear ties to the UFO controversy that I talked about here were the ones in yellow. But certainly ABC, NBC, and Time were known to have been very cooperative with the CIA, at least back in the Cold War era. There are other ways of inserting propaganda into the media, and this is kind of a high-tech example. There's an airplane called Commando Solo, and this is I believe it's a C-130, and it's been converted into a broadcast station. And what they do is they can fly over an area where there's perhaps news being broadcast that they don't want people to hear about, and they can override the local broadcasters and substitute their own programming over the top. So it's an example of some of the more sophisticated methods that they've come up with. Okay, so how do you hide a UFO event? Well, it's kind of straightforward, really, in theory. The first thing is you want to get there first. You want to detect the UFO first. And, of course, who has the best intelligence assets in the world? The U.S. government. The next step is you impose media censorship and using the methods that I described. Then you create a pseudo-environment using the propaganda resources, and then you mop up any loose ends. And of course, you reinforce it with official denials and deceptions to sort of fine-tune the picture that you're trying to create. And I think we've seen this in the Roswell situation and other major UFO incidents. A lot of people are skeptical that this can be done. They say, oh, you can't cover things up. But when they exploded the first atomic bomb at the Trinity site in New Mexico, it was a pretty public event. To put it mildly, it created a blinding light and a tremendous noise, and it was seen and heard by a lot of people in the area. But they were able to convince the press that what had happened was an ammunition dump had exploded, and no one had been killed, and so the press just sort of lost interest and nobody pursued it. So you can hide some pretty major events using these techniques. Another issue that people raise, or question people raise, is the conspiracy issue. You don't really believe that a small number of people can control world events or fool us about things like this. Well, there's lots of examples of this from history, and this is one of them. During World War II, there was an organization called the London Controlling Section, or LCS, and it was a group of very well-connected, influential British aristocrats who controlled all the deception operations for World War II. They were like this little inner circle. If you imagine an onion, at the center of the onion there's a little core, and their deception plans radiated out through the various layers of the intelligence onion to create a smokescreen that completely baffled the Germans. And you probably know about that story. It's quite an amazing tale. If you read a book called Bodyguard of Lies by Anthony Cave Brown, which is where this photo comes from, you'll get a sense of how that works. Okay, well, this brings me to the question, is there any way to cut through all this, this elaborate propaganda that we're being subjected to? How am I doing time-wise? Am I getting close to the end here? 5 minutes. Ooh, better talk fast. We need somebody from New York to do this. Okay, well, I'll just go through this pretty quickly since I'm running short of time. But the one thing you want to remember is that anybody can be fooled. No matter how smart you are, you can be fooled, believe me, given enough resources and effort. And I use this little picture of, if you've ever seen the movie Chinatown, Jack Nicholson is this streetwise private detective. He thinks he knows, how to sort of figure out what's going on, but he's drawn into this elaborate situation, and he's completely baffled by it all the way up until the end of the movie. So don't get too egotistical. Keep an open mind, but try to balance your skepticism and cynicism against that. Now, the regional media are less compromised than the national media. And so the evidence for UFOs, the best evidence is often in the local media. We heard the story of Angela Joyner in the Texas case the other day. That's a good example. I mean, it does tend to be covered fairly well at the local level, but it doesn't get into the wire services, typically. Now, this was intended to be somewhat humorous, but there's a important message here. A UFO event reported by a questionable media source might have some basis in fact. And here it says, space alien backs Bush for president. My comment about this in my last presentation was, well, if the aliens really wanted to destroy us, this explains quite a bit. But, anyway, this sort of may mask a deeper problem, a more serious question, which is there some power relationship between the ETs and our government? It's a question worth asking. Shouldn't just blow it off and laugh about it. And then don't let the authorities make you feel crazy for believing in quote-unquote impossible things. They use that on people a lot. The internet's a very useful research tool, but it is not immune to propaganda and censorship. I just saw a document recently suggesting that the military use blogs as a means of propaganda, and by hiring military personnel to go on the internet and go on blogs and play with people's heads that way. So the internet is a good thing, but it's got its shortcomings. Now, the international media is something very important to follow because they're not as tightly controlled, again, as the American news media. One thing I want to stress also is that we can't do this alone. We have to join up with other anti-secrecy organizations and form alliances and try to attack this secrecy problem from a lot of different directions. Okay, well, I'll just give you, I'm running really short of time now, but I'll just try to whip through this. A few thoughts about national security. This quote from President John F. Kennedy, in times of clear and present danger, the courts have ruled that even the privileged rights of the First Amendment must yield to the public's need for national security. Well, that sounds great, but who really defines national security? That's the important question. Transnational corporations, oil companies, Wall Street firms, the military-industrial complex, all these guys have an interest in manipulating this concept of national security for their own ends. And there has to be more public involvement in deciding what this nebulous phrase, national security, really means, in my opinion. So blind faith that we can sort of turn it over to a few people at the top, like Alan Dulles, who, his interests may have been more connected with Wall Street than the American public, is really not a good idea. So a revolutionary idea, the idea that was embodied in the First Amendment, the American people should play an active role in defining national security. That's what we call democracy. It requires that they become informed by overthrowing the secret regimes that have kept them ignorant. So we have to restore the First Amendment, and that's a problem that we all have to grapple with. And I'd like to ask, which is really the greater threat? Terrorists who kill a few people a year maybe, or the US government secrecy, which has facilitated the loss of trillions of dollars, undermined our economy, and prevented us from knowing our true history. I've talked a little bit about UFO threats to national security. We tend to look at the UFO problem from our perspective, but I think it's useful to look at it from their perspective. This is, of course, a slide from shot from the famous film, The Day the World Stood Still. But if you look at the human race, it's not a pretty picture. We have an ideology of conquest and exploitation, an appetite for extreme violence. We killed 55 million of ourselves in World War II alone. We have a willingness to destroy the biosphere and the climate. We have an emerging space travel capability, and we're starting to harness nuclear and other cosmic energies for weapons of mass destruction. This is not if you were watching us from the outside, from another point of view of another civilization, this would be a bit disturbing and may in fact be the reason why they began to reveal themselves when they did. I don't know for sure, but that's kind of the way it seems to me. And possible responses, well, they might want to try to quarantine us if they could. No more space travel. They might want to monitor and interfere with our weapons programs. We've seen examples of that in the UFO field. And they might want to start a comprehensive program of behavior modification, employing cultural and genetic programming. Okay, well, I don't know how many minutes, have I run out of time? 2 minutes, so. Okay, well, I hate to be I've given you kind of a depressing picture in many ways, so I try to leave on a positive note and hope that we may be able to turn things around. I think there's a couple of avenues of opportunity for changing the course that we're on. One is certainly the new media, the internet, and related technologies. We can do an end run around the traditional media establishment and the propaganda apparatus. And I think the reason that the media is perhaps loosening up a little bit on the UFO subject, we've seen some evidence of this in the television area anyway, is that they sense competition from the internet. They realize the public is tuning out of the television media and the traditional media, and they're going to the internet. So they're scared. And they may be starting to reassess the wisdom of their relationship with the US government. And there may be some event that may trigger public outrage that sparks a popular uprising against the secret government. And that could be a number of things. It could be economic. It could be something else, and I'll talk about that. I'll just skip over the media new media because I don't have time. Well, I'm not going to talk about 9/11 too much, except to say that there's, as you know, a great deal of controversy about what happened on that day. If you look at the public opinion polls, the public is not on board with the government's story to a large extent. And this movement seems to be growing. This could be something that could really become an explosive issue. I also want to point out that although the public, according to the polls, is very concerned about this, the news media will not touch it. The traditional news media will not touch 9/11. And that has all the earmarks of an orchestrated deception campaign, in my judgment. Okay, so remember, when people, when motivated, have the power to force real change. I don't think change about this issue and many others is going to come from the top. Politicians don't like to, they're just the way they are. And so we have to do it ourselves. And I think we're going to have to force the issue from the grassroots up. And I think we can do it. I'd like to leave with this last thought by Daniel Ellsberg, someone who's been at the center of the national security apparatus. He says, "The risks of no secrecy are the risks of democracy. So that's about it.